Good evening. Welcome to Mental Health, Wellness, and Recovery. My name is Richard Weingarten, and I'll be your host for tonight's show. In January, we remember Martin Luther King for the inspirational leadership he showed in the civil rights movement. February, being Black History Month, we remember many other great black men and women, such as Rosa Parks, Thurgood Marshall, Reverend Al Sharpton, and others, who helped black people secure their rights as equal citizens in our democracy. On tonight's show, we will look at the Witness Stones Project, an educational initiative that honors many enslaved black men and women who contributed to the New England economy. In the colonial and post-colonial periods, these forgotten men and women took care of white people's homes. They tended their cows and chickens, planted and harvested their owners' gardens, and looked after their children. They also worked in factories making hoes and axes and other farming equipment that was sold to white plantation owners in the southern part of the United States. Historians credit these black folks with doing the household labor in the 18th and 19th centuries that permitted or enabled white men to work as professionals, artisans, and entrepreneurs, and in so doing, start free market capitalism in New England. On tonight's show, we will hear more the stories of these enslaved black people. Their stories, largely forgotten, were uncovered through research and then written up by school children around Connecticut. Once the stories are told, the names, life dates, what they did, and where they lived are put onto stones. Then in a public ceremony, the stones are placed around the community where residents can see them. The project seeks to restore the humanity of the enslaved blacks and to honor the contributions they made to help build our communities. The stories are part of the Witness Stones Project that started in a Guilford Middle School in 2017 and is now going on in 22 communities around Connecticut and at 4 other northeastern states. The Witness Stones Project is based at Central Connecticut State University and is sponsored or supported by Central Connecticut State University, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Connecticut Humanities, and the William Casper Memorial Fund, among many supporters and collaborators. To help us learn about the Witness Stones Project, I am joined tonight by my guests, Dennis Colleton, the founder of the Witness Stones Project, and Joy Burns, a researcher for the project. Dennis and Joy will tell us about the educational and civic initiative where middle school and high school students are making known publicly the lives of forgotten enslaved individuals from all over New England. Let me begin by welcoming Dennis and Joy to our program. It's good to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Dennis, welcome. Where were you working in 2017, and how did you get the idea for the educational and civic program?
Yes, I was working as a middle school, 8th grade teacher at Adams Middle School in Guilford. And I came up with the program after probably about this time in 2017. I'd given a presentation at the Guilford Free Library, and a friend of mine, Doug Nygren, heard the presentation, was surprised in hearing about Northern slavery. But then he went to Germany, and after investigating some of the memorialization because of the Holocaust that occurred there, he came back and said, could we remember enslaved people by putting a stone in the ground the way the Germans and other people in Central Europe do through the Stolperstein Project? Mm-hmm. So when he asked me that question, the research that I had done on my own, kind of just collecting information about enslaved people in Guilford and Madison, came together. So it allowed me to make an educational unit. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the Common Core standards of writing had come out. The C3 national standards had come out. And the C3 national standards really have the students focus on primary documents, starting with local history, and then sharing their findings with the community. Mm-hmm. So we thought in 2017, what better stories to tell, those hidden stories that have been kind of covered up with a little layer of dust or sometimes hidden in the back shelf. And wouldn't it be great to start telling those stories, especially in communities where you see these wonderful house signs that tell you about all the, all the white people who lived in the house, but fail to tell us who else lived there and how they contributed to society.
How did you get the schools and the teachers on board of this project?
Well, initially, we modeled it ourselves. All the 3 social studies teachers and the 6 language arts teachers at Adams Middle School chose to take on the project. They followed me down the rabbit hole, and when we were done doing it, it was so spectacular. 500 people gathered on the Guilford Green. Children presented their findings. Community singers came, ministers, representatives, state representatives and senators. Rosa DeLauro sent somebody, and all of a sudden people said, wow, this is something special. And after that happened, I was interviewed on WNPR radio on a segment on public history, and after that, people started contacting us, and it's really been that way ever since. We do present to different organizations like the Connecticut Council for Social Studies or the Connecticut League of Historical Organizations, but people come to us and say, how could we do that here? If you could do it in Guilford, could we do this in our community?
And Joy, your role in the program is to do the research, to look up the primary documents that tell these stories or that give information so these stories can be written or spoken about?
Yes, so the primary resources that we find are in historical societies, are in church records. One of Dennis's favorite playgrounds is the property vaults of towns and cities. And so we go there, we page through pages and pages, looking for certain time periods, so say the 1790s, to look for the names of enslaved people, perhaps when they were freed, or in a probate list at someone's death, when they have to list all their property, they would also list the enslaved people as well.
And Dennis, what do the students do with this material? How do they look at the primary documents and make a story, develop a story of an individual?
Yeah, well, for students and teachers, for many of them, it's the first time they've seen a will. Certainly it's the first time they've seen a 200 or 250-year-old will handwritten. So we have to process the documents. We first have to transcribe the documents, highlight the areas where students can gather information from them. But then we don't just send them to tell one person's story. We start them by trying to look at what slavery looked like here. So we have primary documents associated with these 5 themes of slavery, everything from dehumanization to agency and resistance, where the students are using tools that we help them build to extract information and then put together stories.
I see.
And then after we're done kind of the general analysis, the students focus on one person. And that's where they get to, we say, restore the history and honor the humanity of that individual.
So they work in groups then to develop a story for one individual?
Yes, oftentimes they work in groups. They certainly work in groups to understand the documents. And then depending on the schools, we've had everything from wonderful narrative nonfiction biographical sketches to poetry. We've had dance, students create dance, choreographed dance. We've had original compositions and artwork that is amazing. So it's,
what are your general goals for the program?
We say our mission is to restore the history and honor the humanity of enslaved individuals who will help build our communities. To me, I want our students and people in New England to close their eyes and reimagine colonial history. I want them to think of it differently than I was taught growing up in Massachusetts, in next door to Old Sturbridge Village. I would go there and I loved everything about it. But now I know that the lawyer's office was probably kept clean by an enslaved person from Woodstock, Connecticut. So I know these things now.
We're going to hear now a clip from the West Hartford Witness Stones Project. Could you play that, please?
The Witness Stones Project is this really wonderful, unique opportunity for the students here where we partner with local historians, with the directors of the Witness Stones Project, to highlight the humanity of the enslaved people who lived in this town.
I never really thought about slavery in the context of West Hartford beforehand. I had always seen it as, and it's funny as an African American to think that, but as kind of a Southern thing. It's kind of easy to ignore the racial tension or race issues that they have in New England, even nowadays.
Students get to kind of shift their understanding about the role that the North played in promoting and profiting from slavery, and learn more intimately about the life of an enslaved person who lived in our town. And we were able to learn about the life of Pelignot. And he has such a remarkable story, serving in the Revolutionary War.
He was a carter during the Revolutionary War. He supplied the French troops with all of the materials and supplies they needed. It's actually a record of him paying a toll going up Avon Mountain. So that's how we kind of know that he had his own ambition and initiative, and he was his own guy.
He returned from the war and was able to manage 150 acres of land. And then we know that he was eventually freed.
His story is important in humanizing African Americans who lived during this time period, but we can't also say, oh, because one African American man was free and had all this and had all that, oh, they were all treated well. It's not true. Life for a slave was really, really bleak. Your grandchildren are going to be enslaved too. You might get the whip the next morning. I mean, so many bad things could happen, but it's kind of, I like the fact that other less prominent slaves, people who maybe never escaped the bondage of slavery, were able to see and have a little bit of hope when they looked at Pelignot. I feel like it's something that I discovered, not something that was discovered for me, and made me more interested in exploring my surroundings and exploring the world around me. I feel like I'm not just a person observing the world, I'm a person doing things to help uncover things in the world, kind of like an Indiana Jones of of West Hartford history.
Students start to see themselves as public historians. So they're not just, absorbing this information and kind of learning it for knowledge's sake, but we're really asking them to go out into the community and to educate people, to shift the narrative that people previously have about the North's role. I had some students who wrote a letter to the town council advocating for a changing of a name of a street in town. Out of the 40,000 some odd streets there are in West Hartford, we discovered that none of them are named after people of African descent.
They were able and have been able to identify almost 80 Black Americans who were vital members in this town in the 1700s who were slaves. I never thought that West Hartford or some of the surrounding towns had slaves, that there were white wealthy landowners here who had slaves working for them, not as free people, but as slaves. These are slaves who contributed significantly to the economy of this community in its early stages. They weren't even considered human, they were property. We tend as Americans to take our freedom, our liberty, and our rights for granted. But these are people who had none of those things and died without ever understanding, appreciating, or living them. And so they are West Hartford residents. They're in as much a resident here as you or I. I have come to think of it as we found you.
Why did that young Black student not know about Black history in West Hartford? Why don't Americans know about Black history in places that they live? And, why? Why has that history been hidden to us?
Well, the narrative is, and I had a textbook that I used to use, and it said, soon after the American Revolution, slavery ended in the North. And that was the one-liner about slavery in the North. That was the one-liner that ignored the fact that slavery didn't end in Connecticut till 1848. that in the 1790 census, there were thousands of enslaved people in New York, in New Jersey, in Rhode Island, in Connecticut. It ignored those facts. And in Massachusetts, there were many, many enslaved people, but it did end prior or around the time of the American Revolution. So it was here. You know, in Vermont claims to never have enslaved people. There were. New Hampshire, Maine was part of Massachusetts. So our textbooks never taught that. Our teachers in training never learned it. My teachers never learned it. So when I was taught in 8th grade and I was taught in 11th grade U.S. history, it wasn't there to be taught.
Right.
So only with the work of some
studied-
scholars.
I was a history major in college and took American history courses. It was never there
Never
either.
there.
You know, tell us a little bit about the curriculum, because you said there are 5 themes of the curriculum that you teach to the students so that they're prepared to do this work. Could you go over those, please?
Right.
Just briefly.
Sure. And the idea is that when you hand students these documents, these varied documents, census data, church records, marriage records, probate records, that you can't just hand it to them and expect them to come up with the answers. Or you can, but with the younger students especially, you have to give them lenses to look through. So the 5 lenses that I developed after looking at all the documentation I had collected or the research was dehumanization, how enslaved people are treated less than human. You can't treat someone like an animal unless you go through a process. You can't list somebody in your probate inventory as a piece of property without going through that. The next one is treatment of enslaved. We have to differentiate from what people, the myth of good slavery in the North. So if slavery is talked about, and it's like very lenient, it was part of the family. We have to break that myth. The third one is paternalism. Paternalism was enslaved people and free blacks were not treated as full adult members of society. Economics of slavery, if you study economics, it ruins everything because that you begin to realize that all these moral decisions, many of them are made because of economics. And finally, agency and resistance, the most important. We're not here to re-victimize enslaved people. We're not here to tell them their story as victims. We're here to tell their stories as human beings and the decisions they made within the confines of slavery and being a free black in New England that they made to show themselves. And it isn't always what we want to tell. You know, the stories might be you fought in the American Revolution on the American side to gain your freedom. Well, you could have fought on the British side to gain your freedom too. Those are both agency. You can do everything right to gain your freedom, or you can poison your enslaver to gain your freedom. These are all signs of agency. We're not here to judge. We're here to point out this is what people did to show what they wanted to do in life.
I see, the agency. And Joy, can you see a connection between the Witness Stones Project and, say, the Black Lives Movement of today?
What's important about the Black Lives Matter movement is that they're trying to bring the current lives of Black people more into the foreground, to have us learn about folks, about unfortunate things that happen to people. And what the Witness Stones Project hopes to do, especially with the young people, is to bring the stories of enslaved people into the foreground as well. When we walk down the streets of New Haven or Guilford, before the Witness Stones Project, especially in Guilford, there was nothing that told you that Black people ever lived there in the colonial times. In New Haven today, there's nothing that tells you that. And so by bringing the Witness Stones Project in, and also by hopefully doing other projects as well, like things the Amistad Committee is doing or the city is doing, we tell the story of all of the people who were founders, who led to the creation of these towns and cities that we now inhabit.
Okay. And Dennis, you mentioned to me earlier that the students experiencing and researching and creating these stories, there's a difference between the white students who are looking through a window and the Black students who are looking into a mirror. Could you explain that a little bit for us, please?
Yes, and I'm certainly not an expert in this concept of windows and mirrors, but we want students, white students or students, to look through the windows and see people of color in our history books. in our history. They're not in our history books, so we are needing to develop this curriculum so students can see who else contributed to it. Somebody today might be treated as an other, as somebody not part of the community because they don't seem to have been in the past. Well, what if African Americans have always been in our history? What if African Americans fought in the American Revolution to give our country freedom? Then where do they belong? They belong here. And for African American and students of color, for them to look at history books all the time and never see themselves or never see somebody who looks like them or has their lineage, it has to be disappointing at best. And I think, so to imagine seeing somebody from your family, somebody from who looks like they're from your family in the history that they're seeing, in that mirror they're seeing themselves, and how powerful that is. And we're hearing the students reflect that, aren't we? We're hearing the students reflect that in their presentations. And it becomes important because you begin to make different decisions or have a different thought process when you have different, understanding of the true history of our country.
I see. Could you tell us a story, Dennis, of Montrose and Phyllis and their son Moses, who was known as the King of the Slaves? What's special about them?
Well, when we started the project, I really focused on this one family that we found evidence of them being purchased in Boston in 1727, who later were named the Montrose and Phyllis. Montrose was the name of the parish where their enslaver was baptized in Scotland. So we go that far back, and the enslavers were the Naughties. And when we looked at that family, we found that they had 8 children, 5 of which lived to adulthood. And we studied that family some more, and one of the family members was a man named Moses, and he was held in captivity by the Naughties and then by a Reverend, I forget his name now, Amos Fowler in Guilford. He was the pastor of the First Congregational Church, kind of the big man on campus in those days, and Moses was introduced to me through the autobiography of Lyman Beecher, Harry Beecher Stowe's father. He says Moses ran the farm, kept the accounts, rang the church bell, was a factotum, a jack of all trades, sent Reverend Fowler's son to Yale, paid his tuition to go to Yale, and remained a slave because he was king. And those of us who study African Americans in New England, there are slave kings and slave governors in southern New England. I think mostly Connecticut, maybe mostly east of the Connecticut River. I'm not sure. I won't say that. In most of Connecticut, some of Rhode Island, and some of southeastern Massachusetts, and I believe it resembles the West African village kings and governors.
This title was given to them by white people or by other blacks?
Well, sometimes there were straight out elections. Sometimes the same day that the governor of Connecticut was elected, the Negro governor was elected too,
Right.
and the African American governor. And sometimes in communities they elected their own person. So Moses didn't go up to Hartford to get elected. He was in a sense considered the the chief of the African American community in Guilford, and I believe that it was almost like an extrajudicial position. If African Americans had arguments between each other, they didn't want to go to the white magistrate because they might be flogged for that or whipped. So they would go to Moses, and he would be able to adjudicate that.
I see. Now, Joy, you had an interesting story about the Trenton girls, the Lois and Lucy Trenton. Could you talk a little about them, please?
So Lucy Trenton was captured off the coast of Africa, probably in the 1770s or so, and she was brought by Robert Trenton, who was the ship's captain, to Nova Scotia, which was where he was living with his wife Sarah. They had moved from Connecticut, as many Connecticut loyalists did, around the time of the Revolution.
I see.
They
were pro-British, and so they went to Nova Scotia.
Right, and they considered themselves to be British citizens. In 1799, Lois is born to Lucy. And then shortly after then, Robert Trenton's ship is wrecked in the Caribbean. So then there's a list of all of his property, and Lois and Lucy, as well as Tombo and Cato, 2 enslaved men, were listed in his probate paperwork. Sarah, Richard's wife, decides to move back to where her family is from in Connecticut, which happens to be in New Haven. And so she rejoins Trinity Church. Lucy is sitting right beside her in her pew in Trinity Church. She is poor. She needs to find resources. So one of the things that she does is she sells her property. And
so they're sold on New Haven Green,
and
right?
they're sold on New Haven Green in 1825 because this is a way that members of the church can give Sarah Tritton some money. And then they're freed.
Wow.
Anthony P. Sanford, the man who buys them, immediately frees them.
Wow. Isn't that's a wonderful story. Yeah. Dennis, we only have about 2.5 minutes left. Can you talk briefly about where the Witness Stones Project is today and what it's like going to be doing in the future, please?
Yes, we're really busy working in multiple school districts across the state. We're expanding into, we just picked up our second project in New Jersey, and we have a proposal out for additional projects in New Jersey and a second project in New York. So we're expanding, but it's really...
when you say we're, you mean you have a staff, don't you?
Well, I have a staff, yeah. We have Liz Lightfoot works full-time with me. We're both full-time employees. We live off a fee-for-service model, so we do charge schools and historical societies. But we've begun to partner with the Episcopal Diocese of Connecticut, and we're working on 6 projects with them. We're working with 3 projects with Connecticut Landmarks, and we're really trying to reach as many communities as possible, and focusing especially on the cities. So we have, or the smaller cities. So we're in Norwich, we're in Manchester, we're in Hamden, we're in New Haven, both private and public schools, and we hope to continue to. To me, I measure our success by how many students we reach. So I think we're up to about 10,000 students.
If people want to get in touch with you and support your work, can they do that? And how do they go about that?
Yes, certainly. WitnessStonesProject.org is our website, and they can go there, and there's a contact page. There's also a donation page, and we love to have donations or people who are interested in supporting our work. From time to time, we like people to come to us and say, can we do the project in our town? And that's really how we hear about a lot of projects. And people come to us, and then we share what we're doing, tell them how we do it, and then talk with them about that.
Okay. Joy, thank you so much for being a part of the show tonight. I really appreciate it. Dennis, you too, thanks so much for coming on the show tonight. Really, this is really an astounding program, and I'm so glad that it's taking hold here in Connecticut and so many other places like around the New England, really.
Right.
Really great. And thank you, viewers, for looking in tonight and to hearing about this fantastic program, the Witness Stones Project. Thanks again, and I think that's it for tonight.